Coming from an organization that under your tenure, I believe, won 18 Pulitzers, and you won one yourself, I think we all know that accuracy is the most important thing to begin with. You need a good story, but you better get it right.
Amen.
So let me ask you, we've had some great people come to these investigative awards and speak. Chris Bury, who is Ted Koppel's sidekick on Nightline, Jim Avila, my former colleague here in Chicago, was with ABC, Brian Ross of ABC. But you're the one person whose career path tracks a little bit with mine. You spent a long time with one organization, as did I, and then you ventured into this nonprofit world, from the New York Times to the Marshall Project, which, for people who don't know, is an online investigative organization dedicated to criminal justice investigations. And so let me ask you, what motivated you to make a switch like that?
Well, I'd already had all the good jobs at the New York Times. I mean, the Soviet Union isn't going to fall again, so, and 8 years was about as much as anybody should as long as anybody should run a newsroom, I expect. So to some extent I was, I mean, I love the Times, I read it, and by the way, I get a pension from it, so I really root for its financial survival. But a little bit of it was just the sense that you like to think you have another act in you. A startup was an intriguing idea, and a chance to wander out into this let 1,000 flowers bloom world of journalism that we live in now. Some of it, I cannot claim to be an expert in criminal justice, or for that matter anything else, or somebody who's spent a lot of his reporting time writing about these issues. But when Neil Barsky, who was the founder of the Marshall Project, approached me at the beginning of last year, I decided, at that point I had one of the sweetest jobs in journalism, writing an op-ed column for the New York Times. I figured I can write about anything I want. I'll write a couple of columns about criminal justice and immerse myself for a while in the subject and see what I think of it. And I discovered a number of things, some of which will be obvious to the people in the audience. One of them is that the criminal justice system is what the military refers to as a target-rich environment for journalists. It is full of problems. Another was that the caliber of reporting that is necessary to hold those systems accountable was dwindling under the trauma of the financial trauma of the newspaper business. So things that should be covered weren't getting covered as well as they should. And a third thing that drew me to it was I'd been writing a lot about Washington, which feels like the world's greatest case of lockjaw, gridlock, and it was frustrating. And I had sort of sworn to myself that, okay, for the next year, I'm not going to write about Washington much. I'm going to write about states and cities where things actually happen, because there is no common ground in Washington anymore. Everybody's so polarized. But criminal justice is in some measure an exception to that rule. There is some common ground, not universally common ground. There are some issues that where right and left are never going to come together, or at least not in our lifetime. But there are some serious issues where they are coming together. So the potential to get things done, both at the state level and the federal level, seemed real. And that seemed like a clarion call for more journalism, because we're not an advocacy group. We don't have an agenda of specific reforms that should be enacted in the criminal justice system. We're journalists. We go and report on how things are. But changes are made by policymakers, prodded by activists, advocates. But what journalists can do is create the environment where those changes are possible, the public awareness, the sense of urgency. So that's a long-winded answer to your question, but that's what drew me to this project.
Yeah, your model is more the typical one, like ProPublica and so many others. They're journalistic endeavors, which the BGA was for many years. I just thought that we should try to be a full-service watchdog organization. And so when we did an investigation several years ago on wrongful convictions in Illinois, we looked at 20 years of wrongful convictions since the DNA era. We looked at 80 cases of individuals who had been sent to jail for crimes they didn't commit. They'd spent collectively 926 years in prison for crimes they didn't commit. And the saddest thing about that investigation is that in 95%, police or prosecutorial or forensic errors or blatant misconduct contributed to that. So I say that because I consider that one of our most critical areas, from unfair sentencing practices to the bail system to the incarceration system. I think it's not only target-rich in terms of abuse and mistakes. I think you're absolutely right. Maybe it's Ferguson and all the police shootings or quite a few other things. I think it's a time when people are starting to reevaluate our whole approach to that. So I think you have the potential. So let me ask you, in being able to be on a cutting edge of a subject like this, and yet you have the challenge of having to raise money for a nonprofit as opposed to being backed by the mighty New York Times, how different is that? I know I tell people I spend a lot of my time fundraising, not doing journalism anymore. I don't know if that's your situation.
Yeah, well, my previous experience of fundraising amounted to getting in an elevator, riding up to the publisher's office, and explaining to him in very simple terms that if he cut the newsroom budget by $2 million, Western civilization as we know it would be over. I was pretty good at that, by the way. It helps to have a publisher who comes from a family that actually believes in this stuff. There are fewer and fewer of those. In my current incarnation, Neil Barsky and our development officer are the point people on raising the money. I have no qualms at all, however, about going to talk to potential donors about something that I believe in. When you find a foundation or an individual who is engaged by the stories that we're telling and the injustices that are just rampant in our system, there's a connection that's more than just a transaction, and it's incredibly satisfying. I think, in some, particularly with the foundations we're dealing with, they know what the problems are. A lot of them fund journalism over in one silo and criminal justice reform over in another silo, and occasionally the two silos meet. But with some of the individuals that have given money to us, they really had never focused on it before. So the fundraising can be an educational opportunity.
You were at the Times in what's arguably one of the most interesting and tumultuous periods I recall, and we'll talk about a little of that, but let me ask you pick up on where you just left off. Now, the Times has made the leap to digital journalism extraordinarily well. They do some cutting-edge projects with their digital work, and we have a digital presence, you have a digital presence. Michael Bloomberg, I saw is starting a digital service relating to his gun control efforts. Where do you see the sector going? Do you think it's going to keep pace with the shrinkage in traditional print and legacy media, or going to pass it up, or how do you see the sector in our little world of trying to make a difference and tell important stories? Where do you see it going?
Well, I mean, we used to say that not that long ago, the future is online. I mean, now it's kind of obvious that the present is online. And the sort of legacy media, as they're called, will either adapt or die. If anybody comes to you and tells you they know what the business model is that will save journalism, don't buy real estate from those people, because nobody knows. We're in a stage of experimentation. I mean, you can even see it in the sort of native digital news organizations. Like, we being the so-called serious journalists, used to poke fun at BuzzFeed. And sometimes I still indulge in a little humor at BuzzFeed's expense, which started as an aggregator and a provocateur, but not something you thought of as a serious journalistic venture. Well, BuzzFeed has an investigations editor now who, at last count, had 18 reporters working for him. They've got a full-time reporter covering the death penalty. Whether they will figure out a way to make money out of those, whether that's something that they do to establish the sort of a little bit of credibility in the marketplace, I have no idea. But I seize on that as a reason for optimism. Huffington Post started out as strictly an aggregator of everybody else's material, which made us, those of us who were being aggregated, felt a little like were being, attacked by pirates. But the fact is, Huffington Post began investing in actual journalists. I like to think that's because they realized that, yes, people want their cat videos, but they also want some nourishment. They want some serious news. So I see all of that as reason for hope and encouragement, but what the actual mechanics are of, how good journalists get paid a living wage, I really don't know.
What do you see more hope for going forward? Digital startups like what you're doing, what we're trying to do in revitalizing BGA, and what Bloomberg is doing that, or increasing paywalls of the sort that the New York Times has successfully, the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, but not too many others.
Right.
Do you see one being the likelier success story in the next 5 years?
No, I think there will be a mix of survivors. I think the Times will be a survivor. I think the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times and Bloomberg will be survivors. The New York Times, and the only problem with the New York Times is there's only one of them, and it's very hard to replicate what they've done in terms of getting people to subscribe to the digital publication while still keeping the print paper profitable. Bloomberg, Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times have a bit of an advantage in that there are people who need them to do their jobs in the large economic sector. There will be some places that survive through the civic mindedness and largesse of very rich people. I mean, the Washington Post is now run by Jeff Bezos of Amazon, and it seems to be a much happier place than it was when it was struggling under family ownership. I mean, I know a lot of people at the Post. We've collaborated with them on a number of projects. They have a little spring in their step. They've done some hiring. Pierre Omidyar, who's responsible for the startup, The Intercept, all of his journalistic ventures are online. Seems committed to spend a lot of money. I don't think he's worrying yet too much about whether he makes money. He just believes in the mission. So so you'll have that, and there will be some future, I hope, for nonprofit journalism, whether it's small startups like the Marshall Project or Inside Climate News, or somewhat larger and more sustained efforts like ProPublica, which is now in its 7th or 8th year, or the kind of largest of all nonprofits, NPR, which survives by asking people for money.
Well, something I've noticed, and I think that it encourages me at the BGA, it could encourage you and others. I think there's been a rebirth of investigative journalism, at least in the city of Chicago. And I believe BGA's probably played a small role in that. But I think what people have begun to realize in the news business, regardless of your platform, is that most of the day-to-day news, people can get so many places. They don't need your newscast or your newspaper to necessarily do that. You want the weather, you don't wait for the weatherman, you go online. You want the sports, same thing. You can get highlights, all that stuff. But what differentiates publications and news outlets and even in digital watchdogs is the news story you're telling somebody that they're not going to get anywhere else. The enterprise story or the investigative piece that they've got to come to you for because the other guy's not going to have that. Do you agree that that's one of the reasons for hope in this sector?
Yes, but, I guess would be my answer. I mean, and the but is the extent to which the marketplace values investigative reporting as a commercial enterprise. I mean, yes, there is a growth of investigative reporting at ProPublica. We do some of it in the nonprofit sector. NPR does more investigative reporting now than they used to. But in the commercial wing of journalism, it's hard. I do think there's been a resurgence, but I can't tell whether it's a sort of temporary flowering that's then going to wither when they realize how expensive it is to do this stuff. And it really is expensive. I mean, you have often teams of reporters because it takes more than one person to go through the records, and some people have the data crunching skills, and other people have the human skills. It is expensive work, and so I don't feel like investigative reporting is okay, that it's safe.
Let's take a trip on memory lane for a moment. I was looking. Well, I'm not New York Magazine, don't worry.
Okay.
But as I looked over your career and especially your years at the New York Times, I was thinking what incredible number of things. It wasn't just the shrinkage in the broadsheet or the digital pressures that you faced, but it was all these. It was an enormous battle with the Bush administration over the NSA disclosures, and then the banking information you guys got. And along the way, you had Jason Blair. You had Judy Miller getting jammed up in the Valerie Plame story. You had the run up to the Iraq War and the WMDs. I'm just wondering, as you look back over those years, I'll ask you the double question. What are you most satisfied about, and what are you most disappointed about? I guess, or I could have.
Yeah, well, I spent 2 years in a happy exile before I was executive editor. That was my first round of column writing, and I wrote a lot of columns, sort of grudgingly supporting the invasion of Iraq. That goes high on the regret list.
And is that because, as Judy Miller says, that she does her book tour, you just believed these intelligence folks the way she said she did because they had been reliable sources in the past? Yes, that was pretty much it. I mean, I talked to a lot of intelligence people, and I wrote a column once called the "I Can't Believe I'm a Hawk Club," and in which I allied myself, partly because misery loves company, with a whole lot of other liberal-leaning columnists who had also supported the war going in. And some of that was, I think, generational. A lot of us grew up on Vietnam and were very much sort of anti-interventionist, and America can do no right overseas. And then Bosnia came along, and Rwanda came along, and we began to think, America has all this power. It ought to be able to do something good with it, even if that entails dropping bombs on people. And we fell for the Iraq invasion. I think we were sort of hardwired to see this as a good thing. I mean, no question, Saddam Hussein was a monster. Whether or not he had a nuclear weapons program, he posed at least a menace to his neighbors, if not necessarily to the United States. And the notion that maybe this wasn't such a bad thing to do kind of crept up on us. And we were wrong. Journalists, when they find themselves falling for the conventional wisdom, and the conventional wisdom, by the way, at this time was that Iraq was a dangerous place and that America could make it less dangerous. That was Democrats and Republicans, not everybody. There were some wise voices, but they were the voices crying in the wilderness. The intelligence community was united behind this. And the lesson of that whole experience to journalists is when everybody is saying go, you say stop. That's part of your job, is to say stop. And let's just look at the contrary evidence. Let's report against the story. What are you most satisfied about, or what would you say if you write your memoirs? What are you going to say you're proudest of that tenure?
I'm never going to write my memoirs, for starters. I'm a twice-failed book writer, and
I read somewhere that you had a book advance that you've been paying back because you don't have
I
any
finally
book.
paid it back. Simon and Schuster, Simon and Schuster got every penny back from me from that.
Just
for that
didn't
book
feel like
advance.
writing it.
I wrote 2/3 of it, and then I just ran out of steam, and I just realized I thought I'd learned an important lesson that I don't have the metabolism to write books. Magazine pieces, yes. Newspaper pieces, yes, but not books. I mean, look, the best job of all the jobs that I had at the New York Times is being a foreign correspondent for the New York Times, which is like being a foreign correspondent on steroids, because you have an audience that really cares about this stuff and editors who really care about it. And you know, when they did marketing surveys for why people outside of New York would subscribe to a newspaper with the words New York in it, the two answers that we got back over and over again were foreign reporting and cultural reporting. So, you know, you were not the sort of tolerated, you know, cousin, but you were in the limelight. So, and plus it helped that I had the incredible luck to go be sent to places where amazing things were happening, so every story went on the front page. As executive editor, I mean, I think I'm proud of the fact that we did, maybe not at the very beginning, but pretty early on recognized that being a digital publication was going to be different. When I became executive editor, the NewYorkTimes.com was a tiny group of people in an entirely separate building several blocks away who had their own separate union contract and who were regarded by themselves and everyone else as second-class citizens. And over the course of a few years, we integrated them wholly and made the place a genuinely creative digital venture. And by the time I left, this was not by any means my doing. I mean, everything is obviously a collective undertaking at an institution that size, and I had tremendous support from the family that owned us and the publisher. But that change, I think, contributed a lot to the likely future stability of the publication.
So you sat in that seat, and you sat in capitals where major things were happening that changed the world, and you got to see an awful lot from the inside. So just a couple of quick yes/no type questions. Edward Snowden and the NSA disclosures. Is he a hero? Is he a journalistic hero to our profession because he was exercising free speech, or is he a traitor, as a lot of people think, or is it not that simple?
It's not that simple. I mean, there are a number of things we don't know, and if we knew the answer to them, then it would be a lot easier to answer your question. We do not know that the programs that he exposed, I'm talking about the NSA surveillance programs, there are some things that he has disclosed that I think most journalists regard as kind of beyond the pale. But his basic disclosures, we do not know that the programs that he exposed actually prevented a serious terrorist attack. We don't know that because all of the information that relates to that is still classified. We don't know that there was systemic abuse of that program to eavesdrop on people in ways that shouldn't have happened. We don't know, I don't know anyway, that his revelations have caused any tangible harm to national security. And we don't really know that they've resulted in reforms and accountability that is I think, his genuine hope. So, you know, I mean this as a figure of speech, not literally. The jury is still out on Edward Snowden and what his place in history will be.
And Julian Assange. And WikiLeaks also, same story, roughly?
Yeah, he's a trickier character. But yeah, I think the jury is still out. I mean, and WikiLeaks was more of a kind of, I mean, it still exists, and they are still putting out occasional secrets, but they had their one big, you know, fluorescence of amazing leaks, which we were party to. And I think we handled them responsibly. I think some other people, including Julian, did not handle the material so responsibly. But again, we don't really know. I don't know that anybody died as a consequence of the fact that they chose to publish some unexpurgated material that included the names of people who were dissidents in their own country, who had been talking to U.S. military or U.S. diplomats. I just don't know.
2 years ago, Chris Bury was the guest speaker, and he excoriated the Obama administration for trampling on First Amendment rights by cracking down so hard on whistleblowers. He pointed out that this administration, this president, is actually gone after more whistleblowers than any of his predecessors, which might be viewed as ironic for someone who came into the White House with a reputation as a civil libertarian. I'm just wondering what your sense is from the journalistic side. It seems to me that one attitude, and it was exhibited when you were at the Times with the Judy Miller case, is prosecute first and ask questions later.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you go look through the columns I wrote in my last iteration as a columnist, you'll find a couple of them basically making that point that it's paradoxical that this administration, led by a lawyer with some reason to care about civil rights, has prosecuted more leakers than all of the previous presidents put together. I'll say a couple of things as mitigating circumstances. One of them is Democrats have to be more Catholic than the Pope when it comes to national security. It's just the way the political system works. If you're a Republican, you can maybe get away with winking at a leaker, giving him a slap on the wrist and letting him go. If you're a Democratic president and you do that, you're going to be hammered for it. Second thing is that the technology has changed so much that by the time the Justice Department gets around to thinking that they suspect somebody of having leaked government secrets, they have ample evidence that's unignorable. They have cell phone records. They have the records of the badges that government officials use when they go in and out of the office, and that reporters have when they go in and out of the same office. So tracking somebody down is much, much easier, and it's very hard to not prosecute if you have that kind of tangible evidence. And the last thing I'll say by way of mitigation is, in the last year of his tenure as Attorney General, Eric Holder invited a group of First Amendment lawyers and editors. I was part of this group to come meet with him regularly and meet with Justice Department people and make some recommendations on how they could reduce particularly assaults on attempts to go after journalists' records, to subpoena journalists and try to get them to testify about confidential sources. And they were pretty responsive. The kind of test case was Jim Risen, my former colleague at the Times, who was threatened with subpoena and a likely contempt of court citation and jail if he was subpoenaed. And they chose not to subpoena him.
And he had two stories like that. He had the Swift Bank story and...
No, the one that he was being pursued for was actually not something that he...
Oh.
No, it was neither of those. It was one that he did subsequently, and it wasn't in the Times. It was about an Iranian, an undercover operation to mess with the Iranian nuclear program.
What's your message to this group tonight? This is a room filled with people who practice journalism, do investigations, and/or support this cause because they believe it is important and makes a difference. It's a small but important group. What do you say to winners, runners-up, and people who care about this sort of work? Is there like a message to all of us, as someone who was in the middle of so much of it for so long at the Times and now at the Marshall Project?
I'm tempted to slip into NPR fundraising mode and point out that there's a donate button on the Marshall Project website.
You can't do that at my event. I learned.
Right. Support the BGA, and while you're at it.
That's right. You can't raise money at somebody else's event. That's what I've been told many times as I thought about doing the same thing. But other than the fact that they should write checks, which is sort of implicit, what would you say to the group?
I would say, it's great to support advocacy groups. I deal with a lot of them. I've been an advocacy journalist. I guess that's what a column writer is. But there is something very American and very precious about the kind of journalism that the people here tonight were awarded prizes for, which is open-minded, let the facts lead you, and don't be deterred by all the obstacles that are thrown in your way. And whatever you can do to support that specific kind of journalism, which, in some quarters has fallen out of favor, and is hard and expensive work to do, please support it.
Yeah, and I have to ask you follow-up, because we talked about this beforehand. All the work you did at the Times, the work we do at the BGA, the work of everybody in this room that's part of this sector, we see incremental changes, but government continues to be so dysfunctional in so many places, so unresponsive to people, and so much in it. The leaders of it are so much in it for themselves and not for the public. And I'm wondering, we continue to do these stories and these investigations, and yet the systems remain so dysfunctional and so non-responsive. You may disagree with that, but if you agree to some extent, what should we do to wake up in the morning with the idea that the cup's half full and not half empty?
Well, I'll answer in the context of the criminal justice system, because that's what I'm specifically focused on, although you could, I think, make something of the same argument about a lot of other areas where government disappoints us. We don't have a criminal justice system. We have 50 state criminal justice systems. We have 15,000 county criminal justice systems and 1 federal criminal justice system. And they aren't all dysfunctional. Washington, on almost every subject, is so polarized that it can't, do anything. Although I think there may be some ground for some measures in the revising sort of draconian sentencing, trying to create more opportunities for people who are in prison to actually re-enter society with a hope of having a job instead of having to go back to a life of crime, things like that. There is some common ground. But if you go around to the states, you can find lots of interesting things happening. I mean, with an asterisk, I'll give you the example of Texas. Some years back, a think tank in Austin, kind of free market think tank, got interested in the subject of criminal justice reform and the mass incarceration, because, as everybody in this room knows, that we incarcerate more people than any other country on earth. 5% of the world's population and something like 25% of the world's prisoners. And by the way, this costs a lot of money. And so Governor Perry put a proposal to the legislature. They had a prison building schedule and an appropriation for $2 billion to build new prisons for something like, I think, 17,000 more growth in the prison population. And Perry said, let's cut that $2 billion and earmark $200 million for alternatives to prison. And over the course of the next few years, they closed 3 prisons in the state of Texas. The asterisk is Texas started out with the highest per capita incarceration rate of any of the 50 states, by far. They had lots of people that were sort of low-hanging fruit. You could let them out without worrying about the crime rate going up because they shouldn't have been in prison in the first place. But that said, he's provided an example which has now been carried from state to state, including a lot of the southern states, that says you can, as a Republican, conservative Republican, you can advocate closing prisons and decarceration was the awful word, but downsizing the prison population. You can save money, the crime rate won't go up, and you'll get reelected. Has the criminal justice system been transformed by that? No, but there are real pockets of change that are incremental and even a little more than incremental.
And the same conversation is taking place here in Illinois with the new Republican governor. With that, I'll just see if there are a couple of quick questions, and then we'll let everybody get on with the rest of the evening. Yes?
I'd like both of your opinions
On Vice? Yes. Oh, well, it's not my first read in the morning, but I'm not their target demographic. We've partnered with Vice on, when I say partner, that means a whole range of things at the Marshall Project. Sometimes it just means we give people stuff and they can republish it. Sometimes it means at the other extreme that we actually work together on developing, reporting, and presenting a story. With Vice, it's meant something in between so far that we did a piece for the Vice magazine. They commissioned a very good illustrator to provide illustrations, which we got to use on our website. We have another project that I'm not going to talk about because it's competitive, but that we're doing this summer with them. Vice has a vast audience of people like your kids, millennials, who I think are the kind of sweet spot for people who care about criminal justice reform, because they grew up, with no memories of the Willie Horton, race-baiting, fear-mongering campaigns. They grew up with no memory of the crack panic. They grew up in cities that are safer because the crime rate is actually down. And so they're open to the idea that maybe the first response to crime is not to lock people up and let their lives be ruined.
David has a question. David Jackson, one of our Tribune winners.
What do you say to young people who are going in and don't have a career?
David, let me repeat that in case people didn't hear it. The question was, the Tribune Project was assisted by a lot of Medill students. And David's question is, what does Bill tell those young people about career opportunities? Should you go for it in this field, shrinking as it is, or should you, get into private equity where there's clearly a few more bucks?
No, I'm a cheerleader for people going into journalism. What I usually say is, it will be difficult and confusing. And for a lot of people, for our generation, it was not exactly the best way to get rich. Neil Barsky, our founder, started out in journalism and got rich as a hedge fund manager, because while he was a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, he realized you don't have to be all that smart to get rich, and so so he went out and got rich. What I tell students when they ask is, if you're passionate about it, absolutely do it. Here's one way to look at it. What is journalism? Journalism is basically processing information. It's learning how to get your hands on information, often information that people don't want you to have. It's learning how to test information for its accuracy and its significance. It's learning to look for patterns in information, how things add up or don't add up, and learning how to express the conclusions you reach in an accessible, maybe even entertaining way. If you have those skills, and if we're all wrong about the future of journalism and it just dies, there are lots of other lines of work where that would be pretty useful. Those skills are scarce in the law, in science, in teaching, in medicine. If you can do that sort of thing really well with information, there's a market for your talents.
And I just say to young people that you might not make the kind of money as that people made 10, 15 years ago, because it's changed so much, it's spread out so much, revenue streams are so scattered. But I got to say, I've enjoyed every single day of my professional life, and I would have if I made 1/10 the amount, because this is just fun. It's fun to go out and find things out and tell people stories. And there aren't that many professions that allow you to do that. And if you can make a difference along the way, that's even better. But just the job of fact gathering and storytelling should be satisfying to anybody who likes to communicate, either in writing or speaking, or I guess writing and speaking are the two main ways. So anyway, we do one more if we have one. And okay, one more. We have Bruce Rushton, who's an investigative reporter with Illinois Times. It's a weekly Springfield publication. He's regarded as one of the luminary investigative reporters of Central Illinois. He was one of the judges on our panel.
Better have a pretty damn good question after that build-up.
Well, it's a self-serving one. Maybe it's just me, but I've noticed maybe a trend in later years, in recent years, about some fairly small publications getting some pretty prestigious prizes. Is this a trend, and if so, what does it say?
Did everybody hear the question?
Oh, I'm sorry, if you didn't hear the question, Bruce is wondering about a trend that seems to be a lot of mid-size and smaller newspapers around the country have picked up Pulitzer Prizes for their work. And Bruce is wondering if Bill thinks that's a trend to kind of spread out the award world a little bit as opposed to concentrating it only in the big media.
Yes, I don't think it's a brand new trend. I think it's been around for a while. I mean, I've been on Pulitzer juries a couple of times and have judged other awards. And there is a sense that you're not, yes, you want to reward excellent journalism, but up at a certain level, the differences between one paper's investigative project and another paper's investigative project are not all that great. And I think prize juries tend to see part of their job as to encourage more of this kind of work. And another Pulitzer to the New York Times, while I'm all in favor of that, isn't going to mean that there's this much more incremental reporting at the New York Times. An award to a small paper, a struggling paper, or one that's undergone cutbacks, kind of lends a prestige and a status that will make editors and publishers more inclined to invest a little bit. Maybe that investigative team gets to survive for another year or two. So I think there is a deliberate and wholly commendable tendency to try to spread the wealth around in hopes of spreading that it will do what happens when fertilizers spread around and make things grow.
One more.
Bad analogy, I suppose.
We have one more. Well, a lot of the stories dig up a lot of stink. That's very true. So, yeah, one more, and then we'll be done.
With this proliferation of digital news outlets, who fact checks the fact checkers in this new age?
It's a great question, and I'll let Bill answer it. Let me just say this. I think that the good news is that with so much digital circulation of virtually everything in the news sphere, there are 100 places where people can call out bad reporting. And now you have to find it, but I would say that it's a lot easier to have, in fact, virtually everything gets questioned nowadays. Now, that can cause confusion because a lot of the questioning is agenda-driven and not fact-driven. And so, yes, it gets muddled, but I would say that, you see a lot of criticism, but I think the basic question you ask is the hardest one to answer. At the end of the day, it's hard for any one individual to know what to believe from the news sources because there's so many of them, they're so spread out, and there isn't one kind of like accuracy police that basically tells you who is and isn't getting it right. That's why incumbent upon every one of our organizations is the need to really double, triple, and quadruple check our work, which we do at BGA. I'm sure Bill does the same. And all good outlets do it. Last thought, the less you know about it, the more skeptical you might be going in about whether or not it's totally believable.
Yeah. Kind of the glib answer is, the internet has assured that we have 1 million fact checkers. Everything you get wrong will be recognized and eventually corrected. That's kind of a lazy answer. I mean, first of all, it's a lazy way of doing journalism to say, we'll throw it out there and see, how much of it sticks. And it's destructive in the long run because it undermines the trust and credibility of the news organizations that play fast and loose with the facts. And trust and credibility are the only currency we have.
Well, Bill, you get your shining a light pen.
Thank God it's not a laser.
You should all appreciate the fact that I was able to give one of those pens 2 weeks ago to George Lucas. And if there's anybody who should appreciate a light being shined in his face, it would be George, who was here because his wife was interviewing my former boss, Bob Iger of Disney, who was in here for a speech to the Economic Club. So George was just standing there. I couldn't resist giving him a pen, which I hope will endear him to me for life. Thanks for supporting the event and us, and have a nice evening.